Welcome to the Infomullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the Infomullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. Today is December 2nd, first Wednesday in December. This is the Infomullet Facebook Live Ask Me Anything. I am your chief mulleteer, Timothy Clancy, and this is Bonky, the emotional support donkey. A little bit extra after some peaches for Thanksgiving, not that we're going to notice. Got an interesting episode today. The Infomullet schedule for the Ask Me Anything's first Wednesday of the month. We try and do domestic affairs and sort of U.S. interest stories, any breaking news, obviously. Third Wednesday of the month, we try and focus on COVID-19 and national security. But because we are in December and this is the end of a crazy year, what a lot of people don't know, or if you've joined us in the last year, every year now for a couple years, I have a New Year's Eve tradition where I do an Ask Me Anything forecast, and that's where mulleteers can ask for a forecast topic, and on New Year's Eve, I will spitball a gut instinct reaction and just throw out what I think is going to happen in the year ahead. Then I'll follow it up with a short article. Today and on the third Wednesday, we're splitting up those forecasts. There were 19 forecasts in the 2020 New Year's Eve Ask Me Anything. Kind of a bit too much. We're going to try and tone that down a little bit this time. But those 19 covered domestic near-term issues, foreign affair forecasts, what was going to happen overseas or abroad, and some long-term forecasts. So today I wanted to go over a little bit of domestic news that's important here now, but also take a look back at what we thought was going to happen in 2020 and where people were interested in forecasts. So where they were looking at to see the year ahead. And it's interesting to look back and see how much that has changed from that. So if you haven't yet, like, follow, and share the Infomullet. This is our location on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. We've got all sorts of content out there. We do have a store now if you want to visit the store. And obviously, we support our Patreons on whether it's a mulleteer, senior mulleteer, mega mulleteer, Medici mulleteer. We really support all our Patreons. If you haven't checked out the store yet, we've got masks, we got coffee cups, we got t-shirts. If you need to do some holiday shopping, give it a try. If you are a mulleteer and you have a Patreon, make sure you go into Patreon and get your discount code, because I think I've got it set up where you should be able to get a discount code that will get you a discount on the merchandise. Go ahead and check that out. If it's not working because I'm new at this and I've done it wrong, just let me know and we'll get started. But let's go ahead and get started with the first topic. Really is not a forecast review. It's looking at the current events right now. There's something big that's going on in DC, and everyone's kind of focused on coronavirus and they're focused on the presidential election, and I get that, but there's two really key negotiations going on right now that people need to understand from the economic, business, and also coronavirus response, and that's a looming government shutdown and the end of the current coronavirus stimulus. So although I want to do a review of the forecasts of the 2020 forecast, I want to start out with something a little bit more current. And for those who don't know, when we talk about government shutdown, quick TLDR on the process. Every year, the government fiscal year operates from October 1st through September, end of September. So the fiscal year for the government actually started last October 1st, fiscal year 2021. Congress has about 5 to 8 major appropriations bills they have to approve before the fiscal year starts, or there's going to be a partial government shutdown. Now, there's something they can do called a continuing resolution, which kind of kicks the can. A continuing resolution is a short-term measure that basically says everything stays as it was last year. So if you think about this, we were in fiscal year 2020 up through the end of September. And during that time, Congress passed all of the spending bills they needed to, but one. And the one they weren't able to agree on is the National Defense Authorization Act, called the NDAA. And this is the largest appropriation bill. This is where, because these bills are not tied to one specific cabinet or agency. So the National Defense Authorization Act isn't just the Department of Defense, though it includes that. It's a lot of other stuff. And this is a gigantic bill, and this one they couldn't pass. So what they did is, to avoid a government shutdown at the end of September, they passed a continuing resolution that expires on December 11th. What that means is if Congress doesn't pass an NDAA or another continuing resolution by December 11th, the government will go into a partial shutdown. And this has been kind of overlooked because Obviously, in November, we had the presidential election, and then we had second-is election, and then we had mid-elections, and then we had afternoon elections, and then we had thirdsies. And I think Giuliani's still going back to the buffet table for extra helpings on that election. But we've had a lot of elections. They've all gone for Biden. But we're finally getting to the point where the elections are over and we're kind of moving on a little bit. And so all this attention and oxygen have been pulled out of the room. Anything that was left, obviously the coronavirus wave too. I've talked about that before. We had the massive surge going into Thanksgiving week. I think it's going to look low during Thanksgiving week because of artificial testing depression. But by the end of this week, we're probably going to be back up to record highs, maybe over 3,000 deaths a day. That's valid, but I don't think we can lose sight that there's only a few days left for Congress to get their act together. If you think about this, the House of Representatives, so a spending bill has to be passed by both the House and the Senate. The House of Representatives have 9 days in session left, and the Senate has 14 days before they break for the new year. So this is all days left in the December before they go on winter break. 9 for the House, 14 for the Senate. And in that period of time, they've got to pass the National Defense Authorization Act before December 11th and any COVID stimulus if it's going to happen at all. Well, what's happened and I'm going to start with the shutdown risk. It looks like there's some consensus that can be worked out on NDAA. One of the great things about defense is that people tend to come together and bipartisan sort of agree to spend a lot of money on things that are only marginally useful and generally annoying. But, at the end of the day, it gets passed. But there's 2 hiccups here in that there's outstanding veto threats that President Trump has issued. And the first one was issued over the summer, which is what held this up in the first place. He said because in the Defense Act, if you remember the concern about Confederate statues and Confederate legacy, there's a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that will strip Confederate names of Confederate generals from current military bases. Not going to get into whether that's a right or wrong issue. I think the Republican version has it happen over a period of time. The Democrat version has it happen much sooner. But Trump threatened to veto if that provision was contained in there. Since then, he's lost the election. And he's lost the election, and he blames in part Facebook. So a new veto threat has emerged, which to me is much more serious than the Confederate veto threat. That always seemed like window dressing to me. But what's happened is Trump, who has lost the election now, is saying if Section 230 is not repealed or replaced or significantly amended, he's going to veto the defense authorization. And this isn't just like base names. If you look in the links down below, there's a 30-minute backgrounder on Section 230, because I saw this coming in August, over the summer. I think it was August, and I did a long video of a backgrounder. Section 230 is the part of the Internet Communications Act that protects social media from being sued for libel for third-party content. I'm not going to go into that. It's very detailed, but the TLDR is that if you are a platform provider or any sort of social media provider, you cannot be sued for the content that other people put on. So for example, you're all putting comments up on this. I'm the Infomullet. You're putting comments on my page. I can be sued for what I say or what Bonky does because, but I can't be sued for what, Ed might say, hypothetically, or Ken or Valeria or any of those folks like that. So the Section 230 has a really bedrock, and it's being targeted by both Democrats and Republicans. Neither of them are happy with it. But Trump has issued a veto threat that says if you don't repeal or replace this in the next few days, I'm going to veto. And there's a big question of whether there's enough support in Congress to overcome a presidential veto. If they pass a spending bill and he vetoes it, they've got to come back and not just hit a majority, but a supermajority now. And the Democrats have responded to this veto threat with no way. We're not going to negotiate Section 230 from a lame duck president under this kind of threat in this kind of short term. And this sets up a real risk that I think has been missed with everything else going on, that we now have 9 days until there's a partial government shutdown. And the challenge here is you look at where President Trump's at now. The guy's not in a good space, right? He's had a bad month, bad year maybe. He's just lost the presidency. His own attorney general just threw him under the bus with his whole gambit. His legal team can't spell or submit lawsuits. It's been rough for President Trump. I know there's not a lot of sympathy, doesn't necessarily need to be, but he's not in a good space. However, if the government shuts down on December 11th, partial shutdown, not full shutdown, partial shutdown, there's a very real probability that the government would stay shut down until January 20th, which is inauguration. That would make it the longest government shutdown in history. The longest currently, the record is 35 days. that was over August, or excuse me, 2018 through 2019. I covered it on the Infomullet at the time. That was over funding for the border wall. And it's a real possibility that if there is a shutdown and Trump's doing this as some sort of like last saving grace, because remember, right now the Section 230 is just the only thing that's out there. Trump could do something about the election. He could want credit for vaccines. He could throw a lot of monkey wrenches into the spending bill and use it as a threat to shut down the government. Now, that shutdown, if it happens, last time we saw this happen, we saw the Democrats go to their corner, the president go to his corner, and the Senate Republicans go to their corner. They didn't even talk for a good month. So if the shutdown does happen, it may last all the way through inauguration, which would be completely unprecedented to inaugurate a president during a partial government shutdown. And obviously, this can't come at a worse time when we're dealing with the wave 2 cresting spike here. And so if there's any questions on that, I'll go ahead and take that. Then I'll go into the stimulus discussion. So this isn't the only thing that Congress has to face. I'll jump into stimulus real quick, then we'll get to the forecast. The stimulus negotiations is the CARES Act ends December 26th. And a lot of the provisions have already ended, but there's two key provisions that have a cutoff date on December 26th. And so in addition to negotiating this Defense Appropriation Act, there's a separate stimulus act that either has been delayed for months now. And the two provisions that are going to fall off is the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, the PUA. This is 39 weeks for business owners, self-employed, or independent contractors, basically people who would fall through the normal cracks of unemployment. As of October 31st, there's about 9 million people receiving this. If nothing gets passed December 26th, that stops. They're out of it. The second big provision that comes up as an expiration on December 26th is the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, PEUC. This is 13 weeks of additional unemployment after they've already expended the existing state unemployment. I think the existing state is 26. This takes it up to 39, or maybe it's 13 and 26. But both of these are set to expire, and there's about 4.5 million people on that one. So people who have watched us have known that these stimulus discussions have pretty much gone on since the original CARES Act was passed last March and April. There's 3 proposals out there right now, 2 of which are probably non-starters, and 1 of which is a compromise but has been shot down. So let's go through real quickly. The McConnell version, pause for the cheering of my McConnell fan club. I need a t-shirt about McConnell fan club. But anyways, the McConnell version is the only thing that has failed more than the McConnell version of the Stimulus Act is President Trump's election lawsuits. McConnell's version, it's a very narrow version. It does a 1-month extension of both of those unemployment programs I just described. And basically what it does is it says, if you're already in it, you get 3 months to phase out, and we cut off new people after a month. So it's a very limited extension. They're going to do a second round of PPE, try and tailor it more to small business to say, look, you got to be under small business sizing limits or 300 employees, and even do a set aside for ultra small business, 10 employees or less. They're doing educational support, but that's kind of some really limited state grants. It's really more tax credits for educational savings and expansion of 529 payment. That's not really stimulus. It's kind of more of a tax policy. It's not very effective in times of crisis for deploying resources because it's a tax credit. And then 105 billion to the states to get students back in school. So there's also a restaurant provision in there. They're trying to improve business at restaurants because clearly what we need is more people in the restaurant getting sick with COVID. But that increases the business meal deduction 100%. And there's a charity increase. So there's a lot of tax provisions. I think the only real stimulus you could say is a strategic supplies statement where they're going to stockpile PPE, vaccine. There's money for that. So that's kind of a manufacturing stimulus. That one, no one seems to support. Even McConnell runs the Senate, can't even get GOP support for it in the Senate. The second proposal is the Democrats one, which is, so that's Goldilocks, right? If that's Goldilocks, that's way too small. That's the littlest stimulus. The largest stimulus is still the House Democrats, Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats. They have gone back and continually revised this. It's moved from $2 trillion. The president has said he'll never sign that. They're down to about $1 trillion now. And it's basically everything I just described, more, plus hospital funding, more state support, and a stimulus check. That's the key thing. The McConnell provision does not include a stimulus check. The House Democrat one would, but that's about $1 trillion, over $1 trillion. McConnell signaled that as DOA. The third has just come out in the last 24 hours. This is a bipartisan group. I think Senator Romney's involved. There's a few House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and it's kind of like the middle Goldilocks, right? It does 4 months extra for everyone, PUA and PUC, those unemployment extensions. So it extends it for 4 months, doesn't have a phase out. It puts forgivable loans for small business. It does support for vaccine. It does more PPE, but it doesn't have a stimulus check. So I think the big differences between these three is the Democrat version in the House, which is fairly large and relatively speaking, has all the support, that's being described, plus the stimulus check. The McConnell has the least, no stimulus check, and the bipartisan one is in the middle. And they, like I said, they got 9 days and 14 days to sign this before they go on winter break. So it'll be interesting to see. It's going to be a very tense time in Congress to negotiate these, and these have real impacts. The states need the support to deploy the vaccines that we're all hearing about. They've needed the support just to cope with current pandemic situations. We're going to have more and more cases coming up that is exacerbated by the inability to have kids home from school, who's providing daycare, essential support. I mean, this whole thing is interlocked with the state of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think looking at Republican strategy, they were kind of thinking this would magically go away and they could push it off. And because everything expires in December 26th. Well, we're now going to have an expiration right in the peak of wave 2 or the aftermath of wave 2, depending on when it crests. So here's a question. Let's see. Oh, lots of good. So let me say hi to some folks. Valeria, Christy, Albert, Ken, Celia, Laura. Everyone's asking for autographed Bonky photos. We can figure that out. There's stickers. If you go on the store, there are stickers of Bonky. It's the Dr. Falconberry Bonky logo. I can also try and get a photo of the live Bonky. We both Miss Falconberry did a great job of animating us. So the animated Bonky is a little different from that. But we do have stickers like that on the store. Question, Ishmael, what parts of the government would be shut down on 11/12 December? So Ishmael, the way government shutdowns work, partial shutdowns, and these I say partial because normally about 76% of the government stays open. But OMB has an authority to identify which parts of the government stay open and which don't based on mission essential. And basically every department and every agency has to submit who are mission essential personnel. Mission essential means safety, welfare, security, mission critical infrastructure, things like that. And again, so in the past, what often happens during shutdown is OMB will issue instructions to the agencies to tell us who is essential or not. This creates a big area of uncertainty that if Trump appointees want to put the screw job on an incoming Biden administration, they can really come back and say very few people are essential. I don't think they'll do that to extent, but in the past, what we've seen is, first of all, non-essential DOD personnel, and if you're DOD, you probably know if you're essential or non-essential. Non-essential have traditionally been furloughed. If you're a government employee, that furlough means you're not paid, but you will be paid back. If you're a contractor, like myself, you simply don't, it depends on the contract, but generally you don't get paid and you don't get paid back for the time you miss. If you're a vendor or something like that, and obviously like working in a cafeteria, those facilities get shut down, you do it. The ripple effects can be quite large, but I want to be clear here that partial government shutdown generally means about 76% of the government remains open, or at least the spending levels do, and about 25% are actively shut down and furloughed. And national parks always get hit, and given the resistance to Trump, I don't think they're going to be spared. Other questions. Laura has said, McConnell has said he wants COVID in the NDAA as it's a very skinny stimulus and hinges on companies not having liability for COVID employees. I think that is a bigger threat to the shutdown. Have said, yeah, so what you can do, there's a term you're going to hear called omnibus. An omnibus bill is when you combine multiple spending bills into one. And it's kind of like everything in the kitchen sink. It is certainly possible and legal for the NDAA, this National Defense Authorization Act. Remember, I said it doesn't have to be just national security and defense. They could pass a joint omnibus bill that includes COVID-19 stimulus and the NDAA all in one bill. The problem is the gatekeeper on that, as Laura mentioned, is McConnell. And his provisions, he wants liability protection for businesses and schools. And the Democrats have said that's non-starter. So one of the challenges of omnibus, one of the reasons you do an omnibus is everything, it has to be passed. So you throw everything in and everyone kind of grits their teeth and signs off on it. The problem with an omnibus is if someone is a stickler on one of those provisions, they may have passed the NDA on what's called a clean resolution, a clean slate. You're just doing the NDA and they can deal with stimulus separately. Once you combine them, you run the risk of the complication. Now, in normal times, I don't think that'd be too much of a risk, but these are not normal times. And I think the first thing is getting something navigated through that the House and the Senate can agree upon. And then if the president vetoes that, like after all these negotiations, the president vetoes that because it doesn't have a section 230, there is no way you want to do a section 230 change unless it was simply a unenforceable resolution that said, you know, hear ye, on behalf of the outgoing President Trump, we have changed section 230 to be 230 previously known as section 230, you know, something like a title only. Trump vetoes something like that, you got a real mess on your hands, because then you get into the press back and forth, the feedback effect. Mike says his county's going back to hybrid learning, 2 days on school ground, 3 days online learning. Yeah, contractors get furloughed with no back pay. It does depend on the contract, but most contracts will not do it. And then this is Lisa and limited unemployment. I feel your pain, Lisa. I run a small consulting firm. We often do a lot of federal contracting work, especially with the DoD. We get hammered every time there's a government shutdown. Yeah, and the payroll, Rory's mentioning the federal employees had payroll taxes deferred until January 2020. That's another thing because they'll have to pay up. The deferment was not a waiver, it's a deferment, so they'll have to pay the outstanding payroll taxes in January 2021. Yeah, Lucas is mentioning about the Confederate generals. I think, Lucas, what I saw looking at this morning is he's backed away from the Confederate generals, which I always thought was more symbolic than anything else, and really pushed in the Section 230. That's the one he wants to, I think, put his legacy on. Yeah, so there's a discussion. Yeah, there was a discussion that federal employees sometimes had an option of doing the payroll defer. I don't want to get into payroll deferment because that gets pretty complex, and I wanted to do it. But let me pause here. We're gonna head over to the forecast. But before I do, people were asking, where do you get your autographed Bonky picture? If you go here, this is there's actually a mask with Bonky on it. If you go to this site, the tiny URL is down there. It's actually Teespring, but that URL will take you to the merchandise site. Take a look at what we've got there on the store. We do have some Bonky stickers, things like that. If people want signed hoof print Bonky things, let me know. I'll figure out a way to do that. There might be some special details in that, or I might need some assistance, but we'll figure it out. Again, there's masks, there's t-shirts, there's coffee mug stickers, there's an extra helping of Swedenfried on the thing. And if you are Patreon, you do get a discount. Speaking of patrons, we're going into these forecasts. If you are a, let me take a look here. If you are a mega mulleteer, so this is the first forecast I'm going to review, and this is the format I'll review them in. If you are a mega mulleteer on Patreon, not only you get a discount on the merchandise and all the other things, but you get to submit your forecast questions. So these forecasts, if you submit them now in December, I'll collect them. If we get more than, say, 15, I may put them up to the vote of all the mulleteers so that people can vote. I want to do about 15, not much. I'll do a live episode on New Year's Eve for anyone who's at home by themselves. We'll do a live episode. I'll spitball a forecast. But in addition to a spitball, what I do is I go through and do an actual article on every single forecast with more systemic reasoning of why I make the calls I do, what you should look for, what is going to tell you that this forecast is going to come true or not going to come true, and what some of the contingencies are that if I'm wrong, how I will be wrong. One of the things with forecasts I think that's important is you need to say not just what I think will happen, but why it will happen, and if you're wrong, how it will be wrong, and then go back and do what we're doing and hold yourself accountable. So if you're a mega mulleteer on Patreon, not only you get the discount on merchandise, but you can submit your forecasts. And you know, those of you who submitted in 2020 obviously had an inkling of concern of politics and instability. So the theme is politics and instability, but if you want to know what's coming up in 2021, submit those forecasts and I'll get them back to you at the New Year's Eve, ask me anything, and then the articles will roll out in early January. So stepping in, easy forecast, softball serve. Came to us, who fares better in the 2020 presidential election, right? That was the first one of, and these again, these are domestic. So question one had an international flavor. The numbers will be a little off, but these are the domestic ones that would resolve in 2020. My forecast for the 2020 presidential election was that Trump would win by a narrow electoral margin, but lose the House and Senate. Obviously, partially wrong. But when I describe this, and again, the links to these articles, so I'm not making this up. You can go back and read the original forecast from last January. The contingencies, I said that if I was wrong, I'd be wrong because the Democrats nominated Biden. There was a sharp recession, a brief war, or an unexpected impeachment outcome. Now, we didn't have a brief war, but they did nominate Biden, and we certainly had a sharp recession. So, you know, you guys judge what kind of credit I should get on this. Trump didn't win by a narrow electoral margin. He lost by a narrow one, but he lost in a scenario where Biden was nominated and we had a brief, or not a brief, but a sharp recession. So. And that's how I'll go through these and do the format here. So let's take a look here. That's question 2. Question 4 was pretty simple. It was the forecast was, does impeachment cost the Democrats the House? Here, we'll catch up. So question 4, does impeachment cost the Democrats the House? Remember impeachment? Remember what impeachment was? That was a big deal in December of 2019. People were concerned about and thinking about 2020. And it's kind of funny looking back at these. It's interesting to look back and see what we were thinking about. That I don't remember anyone really bringing up impeachment that much during the election. Sure, there was a lot of partisans out there that brought it up on either side, but it wasn't really a major issue in the election. And my forecast was that no, this wouldn't hurt the Democrats in terms of the House. The opinions in President and Congress were cemented in place, put into a securely locked vault, encased in concrete, taken to the bottom of the ocean, from which they were buried at 1,000 feet below the crust of the earth, from which change will never come. The level of polarization in this country right now is so high that I don't think these you know, whether you agree or disagree with impeachment, thought it was right or wrong, it wasn't going to move the dial all that much. People who were already Trump supporters stayed Trump supporters. People who were already anti-Trump stayed anti-Trump. And correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see it as being a major issue in the election. It was overtaken by everything else that happened from March forward, as opposed to what we thought would be the big story of 2020 would be the impeachment in January. And it kind of ended up being a nothing burger. So those two were pretty simple. Next question up, here we go, would be question 5. Again, this is what people were interested in at December 2019. If he is reelected with the GOP House, will President Trump do a better job than he did before with complete control? What this is looking to is the first congressional session that Trump was president. The Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the president. And it's probably one of the least effective sessions where you had one party control everything. They could barely get anything done. They nominated a Supreme Court nominee that McConnell had to kill the filibuster to get through. They tried and failed repeatedly to repeal the Health Care Act. McCain went against that at first. Was some of the deciding votes, I think, with Murkowski and some others. They just weren't able to get much done. They struggled. This was even before the wall. The wall wasn't even being. I mean, they had tried, but there was no forward movement of the wall on this session. And this session is 2017 through 2018. So my forecast is, if he's reelected, will they do a better job? If he gets the House and the Senate, will they be better? I said no. First of all, I didn't, even assuming he wins the House, which he won't, I had predicted in that last forecast, he won't take the House. Competence matters. So what you need to understand with the federal government, this is important for like these federal shutdowns, is there's about 4,000, and this, think about for Biden's transition. This is a little bit over historical now, but think about this in terms of Biden's transition. To run the federal government, there are 4,000 presidential appointees managing about 2 million federal civilian and military personnel, not counting contractors. That is a giant amount of people you have to manage. 4,000 people just in senior leadership positions. So think of this as this 4,000 is a stock that has a constant inflow you have to bring in and an outflow of people leaving by resignation, tweet firing, jail sentencing, pardon to avoid jail sentencing, on trial prior to being sentenced in jail. Well, the outflow is all the reasons people are no longer in those jobs. So you have this churn, and you have to keep 4,000 people in place to manage the government effectively and have all the pieces work well, along with your Senate liaisons, your House liaison, your congressional. These agencies do a lot of work of making Congress buy into the president's thing. Now, normally the Republican and Democratic Party, they have an inflow, constant inflow that comes from existing universities, think tanks, campaigns. Each party at this point has a well-built infrastructure where they can basically bring in people. So you're seeing with Biden's transition right off the bat, there's going to be a difference because Biden can tap into the existing Democratic infrastructure to bring in these 4,000 appointees he's got. And these aren't just secret cabinetary. These go down to assistant secretary, undersecretary. Basically, the way it works is the president gets slots. 4,000 slots or so, and they can put these slots wherever they want. So they may want, if they really want to be focused on Department of Defense, they'll put a lot of slots in Department of Defense. They may put less in HUD or Bureau of Economic Affairs. If they want a lot in, say, Treasury, they'll overstaff in Treasury. So you can allocate these slots, but you have to fill them. And both institutional parties have huge pipelines where talent comes in, people move through career. Obviously, if you were on the campaign or a supporter, that helps you out on the higher level positions. But even at the lower levels in these presidential appointees, there's a pipeline. Trump didn't have this pipeline. He was a populist, so he's not really tapping into the existing Republican infrastructure that, let's say, Bush the third or Cruz the first or Rubio the hopeful won the presidency rather than Trump, right? They would be, as mainstream candidates, they would be able to tap into the Republican infrastructure very quickly and easily. Trump didn't have that. So he largely was grasping at straws to fill his cabinet. Now, he had some very high-level picks in his first term, you know, you have the Secretary of Defense Mattis, some good names there. But for the most part, he's picking from his campaign, and he's often getting very underskilled people. While he was in office, his personality and leadership style made it toxic to want to work in that. No one wants to everyone looked at Tillerson. Here's the executive of Exxon, CEO of Exxon, leaves the job at CEO of Exxon to go be Trump's whipping boy in Department of State. And just no one's going to want to do that. People can see the writing on the wall. If you're going to get fired from tweet, you're not going to want to do it. So his pipeline gradually dried up. And to the point where at the end of this term, we had a lot of vacancies that had not been filled. And where they were filled, we were seeing some cases where high-level civilian presidential appointees were people right out of college, 26 years old, very little experience. And I'm not saying that if you're young, that means you're not qualified for this. But if you're managing 1,000 or 10,000 or 50,000 person federal agency, that's not an easy job. And so I think when Trump was always facing, first, I didn't think he was going to take the House. Second, turns out he didn't win. But he was always going to face a challenge in maintaining this administration. This is key to think of Biden coming in now. How does he put in that pipeline? How does he take advantage of bringing in old guard institutionalists, mixing it with more progressive? And this is the tension that's right now you can see going on in the Democratic Party. How is Biden staffing his administration? Where is he pulling that talent from? What think tanks, what campaigns, what action groups? All of these things matter in the administration because it really gets down to the nuts and bolts of how the government will function in supporting the president. So let's pause here real quick. If you haven't yet, if you want to see forecasts for 2021, go ahead and make sure you're a mega mulleteer on the Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/infomullet. Send me your forecast by the end of the month. We'll get them up on a New Year's Eve. Ask me anything. Each forecast I'll do the top line forecast. We'll do a brief article about why I think it is. Like with this thing, I try and provide a little more reasoning than just saying, no, I don't think it'll be better, but why. Also, if you want to just sign up, we appreciate all the Patreon support, mulletiers, senior mulletiers, mega mulletiers, Medici. And so again, check that out, www.patreon.com/infomullet. And so let's take a look now. The next few, that was the political one. We knew going into people in 2019 looking at 2020 were saying election, right? So they were thinking election, impeachment, what's going to happen after the election. But there was also a lot of questions that had to do with instability. And this was interesting to me because at the time, there was this obvious concern about radicalization and instability, but it was a lot of questions are like, are we going to see it? Where are we going to see it? And this was both in the domestic sense, which I'm going to go over today, and also a lot of international instability questions, which I'll go over on the third Wednesday, the second one. So let me get this one up. The next question on the forecast, this would be question number 7. And again, all the links for these articles where I go into a lot more in detail on each one are in the links to this Facebook. And if you're watching on YouTube later, they're down in the comments section. When it comes to instability, this is kind of my sweet spot from an expertise. I tried to go through a lot of analysis methods and perspective of frameworks of how you would go about answering this question. So yeah, I give an off-the-cuff system scientist question, New Year's Eve. This is my gut instinct, but I try and back it up with what it is I'm counting upon or thinking about when I make this. So the question here is, what areas in the US are ripe for civil unrest in 2020? What factors are feeding the potential conflict and how might it play out? So my forecast, bear with me, I said I forecast no major sustained civil unrest in 2020. You have to, a little caveat, what I think of major sustained civil unrest probably isn't the same as what all you think about as major sustained civil unrest. But I did caveat in the article, and you can go to the article, I said there may be riots, there may be property destructions, and this is key. There may be property destruction riots emerging out of protest and police overreaction after shooting events. So where I said I was wrong, I described myself as being wrong in a way that actually is what ended up happening. I didn't know there was going to be, a major Black Lives Matter movement in end of May 2020. But I mentioned it several times, and if I'm wrong, this is how I'm wrong, because I saw the conditions. And I also said, or there might be self-defensive riot between opposed political groups. So if you think about the civil unrest we've had, which I would not classify as major civil unrest. I mean, I know that's hard for people because social media has the spotlight effect where we tend to see something and think it's massive. There were a lot of protests, but not what I would classify as sustained mass civil arrest, the same as like the riots after the Martin Luther King assassination or some of the civil rights riots where there was just mass violence going on. We didn't see that too much, but you can disagree with me on that. But where there was violence, clearly we had violence, but it was isolated and it was limited. And I think that bears out in the numbers. I mean, the total dead since the start of the protest in May, maybe between 2 and 3 dozen, right? Over a period of multiple months, not hundreds, not thousands, not tens of thousands, clearly. And why is this? So in the article, I go into one of the first things you need to know about what drives mass instability is there's a structural demographic piece. And this is going to get a little wonky, but it's hopefully to educate why I made this forecast. And it gets into a key element for any forecast of 2021 on the same question. There's 3 things you need to understand from structural demographics when it comes to instability. First is the number of fighting age male population. That's called FAM, F-A-M, fighting age male. And it's called fighting age male because traditionally it's men. You can probably expand that to fighting age men and women or whatever you want to say, but traditionally in the studies it's called FAM. This is an age from 15 to 34, specifically from 15 to 24. And how big is that demographic cohort relative to other population segments? It isn't enough for it to be large. If it's much smaller than all other age demographics, then it's not going to matter. And Gen Z, the Zillennials or the Zoomers or whatever you want to call them, is a smaller age demographic than the millennials. They're much more like Generation X. Boomers were huge, millennials were huge. The Zillennials, not so large a cohort. The second demographic is a relative comparison of socioeconomic status for this FAM demographic, this FAM cohort, this fighting age male to generations that came before. And that can get really tricky, but you're kind of asking yourself, how am I doing relative to people of my age at similar times in the past? And there's a fairly easy proxy for this that you can get into that I use, which is simply unemployment. And unemployment gives you a sense of, it tells you a lot of things that can go on. First of all, if you're unemployed, you don't have a job, you need to show up to the next day, you can be out late, you can be involved in protests, you aren't doing it. You also have less of a suppressant. If you have a job and you're worried about a political retaliation or some sort of blowback on your job, that may be a constraint. So the size of the fighting age male demographic and its unemployment rate are 2 very key factors in this demographics. And traditionally, why I made this forecast, I said I don't think there's much, is traditionally we're at 12 to 19% unemployment for that age demographic, and we were only at 10% up to age 18, and it drops to 3 to 4% after that. So going into the year, we had very low unemployment. Now, obviously, people of color, communities of color, those unemployment rates tend to be a little higher. And so those numbers don't necessarily hold. So making this forecast, I was looking at, end of 2019, going into 2020, I said, unemployment's relatively low. The age cohort is fairly small relative, but look at what's happened. Let's take a look now at where we're at for unemployment just last year to this year in these demographics. And I've circled them in red. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They come out with unemployment numbers every slice and dice. And this is the E16, I think, table. It's a little cut off there. It's unemployment rate by age, sex, race, and Hispanic or Latino ethnicity. So just to read the chart, this is age and sex down the bottom. I've cut it off at a certain point. You have the total across the country, and then they look at white, Black or African American, Asian, Hispanic or Latino, and they're really comparing third quarter 2019 to third quarter 2020. So we're really focusing now on the change, the demographic change in unemployment after this pandemic year. And this is why I'm calling some red flags right now for 2021. Let's first of all break it down by a major racial group, right? White, 16 to 19 years old, it went from 12% unemployment to 17% employment. Remember, if you're youth, unemployment's always higher than the national average, but it jumped 5 points last year to this year. Black or African American went from 18% to 25%. That's a very high number. That you're talking about a quarter of the population now out of work in that key demographic. Asian, 12 to 21%. Hispanic, 16 to 23%. Anytime you have a number over 15%, you're in a warning area, and 25% or higher is a danger sign. And also it applies to, normally unemployment rates drop once you get 18 or older. It's much worse if you're a teenager and or you're just getting your first job. And then if you're 20 to 24 years, it drops. And you can see this where it was from 12%, 16 to 19 years, whites, 20 to 24 years drops in half, 6.3. That's a fine number. That's an okay number. It's doubled in the last year to 12%. And that's in the white. And as I mentioned, if you're a community of color, you're going to have, and systemic disparities are working against you, you're already, the deck is stacked against you, you're going to hit it worse. So 20 to 24 Black or African American fighting age male went from 12, doubled to 25. Asian from 8 to almost 20. And Hispanic or Latin America from 6 to almost 14%. These are not good numbers. These numbers give me concern. If somebody wants to ask a forecast for the same forecast, where do I see causes? That number would cause me to be very cautious about what I'm saying in the forecast for 2021 compared to what I said for 2020. And the last aspect of this question 7, what is the third structural demographic? This one has to do with your expectations. So expectations is how I'm looking at the future. And you can think, if I think that the future is going to be not just the same, but better for me, you can think of my future expectation as an incline growing up. And that's a good expectation. As I get older, I get more skills, I get more money, I have more security. If your future expectations decline from where you think they were, it's called an expectations gap. Things like income inequality, things like unaffordable housing, things like student debt, they all contribute to this perception that I thought my future was going to go up at a certain incline. Now I see it as going up as less of an incline or even flat. That perceptions gap, the larger that perception gap is in expectation, and this is important, this is perception. This isn't like something you can go out and measure with a thermometer or a gauge or something like that. It's about a perception. And countries around the world have been hammered by this. A big cause of the Arab Spring, a big cause of the riots and protests you've seen in Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran are from large youth demographic bulges that have, and you'll see this when I do the international things, the same thing comes up. Their expectations of what's going to happen ahead have dropped, and the expectations gap has fueled instability. You see this in South America, protests in Bolivia, Argentina, Chile. Expectations gap can be a crucial driver, and clearly people can argue it. There's arguments on both sides as to where the expectations gap were from 2019 heading into 2020. Again, heading into 2021 with the pandemic, that expectations gap is going to be even more prevalent. So pausing right here to see if there's any questions. And if you're just joining right now, don't forget, we do have, for your holiday shopping, Wear your context on your sleeve. I'm gonna try and get better like legal with the really smooth transition that you almost don't notice, but I'm not quite that suave yet. But if you haven't checked out the Infomullet merchandise store, it's up now. We got t-shirts, masks, stickers, including stickers of Bonky. There's face masks of Bonky. There's stickers of Bonky. Bonky's hot. I'm telling you, he looks good in blue. There's even some Swedenfrade, which is we have a design that's basically says Infomullet 1, Sweden 0 halftime. And if you are a Patreon, we greatly appreciate your support. So we're throwing you a discount. If you have any holiday shopping to do, check it out. We appreciate the support, and just wanted to put that out there so I can get the plug in. So back to the forecast. Next one is also related to instability, and I'm checking to see if there's any. I don't see any questions yet, but if there are more, I'll try and get back to them. The second question on domestic instability was, remember back in 2019, Hong Kong was the top of the news. The instability in Hong Kong. I did my dictator's dilemma structure. It had protests all over the summer of 2019. It had turned into literally a failing city-state by the November of 2019. So one of the questions 2019 leading into 2020 was, hey, what does it take for U.S. citizens to mobilize like you're seeing in Hong Kong? And the example they gave was like corruption. And are we going to see mass mobilization sustained at the Hong Kong levels? Now, remember, Hong Kong mobilization is an order of magnitude higher than what we're seeing here, both by per capita, by intensity, by sophistication. They've obviously been practicing it a lot more, but they are, before the big crackdown happened midway through this year, the Hong Kong mobilization was what I would call a mass mobilization. They had hit that threshold of the population. The Black Lives Matters movement, the protest, and even this post-election nonsense protest of the election fraud and all that, those have not hit mass mobilization levels. You're talking about 4 or 5% of the total population going out, 7% of the total population going out and being mobilized. They've been significant, but they aren't mass mobilized. And the reason why, when I talked about this forecast, I said there's going to be no mass mobilization in the U.S. on something like corruption. I said red-blue polarization is on causes like corruption. You know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's a classic way of thinking about how do we viscerally react to things. The last thing I talked about instability was very techie, wonky, structural demographics. This is now much more emotive and personal. And the hierarchy of needs, it starts at physiological concerns, my personal comfort, security and safety, and then it goes all the way up to like self-identity actualization. Do I feel good about myself? Do I feel good what I'm doing? Do I have a self-identity and associative? When we talk about red-blue polarization for most population segments in the US, most, not all, it's at what I would call the higher level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's about self-identity. I'm blue because I support these things, and I'm red because I support these things. I get warm, fuzzy neurochemicals by being part of my self-identity and doing that. That is a level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that's not going to sustain mass mobilization, and people are not going to risk their jobs, their comforts, to go out and get arrested and spend time in jail when it's much easier to argue on social media for the 5,000th time about why red is horrible or blue is horrible. So when you're at this level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs where it's about abstracted self-identity, that's not going to sustain. I mean, you may have flare-ups, you may have things like that. It's not going to sustain mass mobilization protest. What's different, though, is if what you're protesting is a matter of physical security or safety. And this is where I talk specifically. If you see mass mobilization, it's going to occur in places like Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is much more, this isn't like an abstracted, how you feeling? It's literally like we are experiencing this in our communities. We live it every day with the police over policing, the threat of what we perceive as violent police reaction or overreaction. This is about security and safety, and therefore it's a much lower level of hierarchy Maslow's of needs, and it's much more sustainable to drive forward. And I think you saw this. So when I did this forecast and I said no, I said exceptions are, and this was interesting. I said one of the exceptions is Black Lives Matter. That's a gimme, not hard to predict that. If there's a police shooting, that's been the trend in the recent days, it happened. But I also mentioned sharp economic hardship. And this is important, I think, for people to understand. When we talk about these pandemic responses, you can't just poo-poo the economic harm that results from the shutdowns. Now, I think the government should be supporting it and stepping in, just like if we're in a wartime or some other national crisis. But when you have a sharp economic hardship, that hits you right in the physiological, the security and safety and comfort. Where am I going to sleep? Is there going to be a roof over my head? Am I going to have food? Is my kid going to be able to do things? Those are enough to get people motivated and out there. And to the extent I think we saw these Liberate Michigan, stuff like that. It's easy to call it nonsense because the pageantry around it was a little bit silly, but these kind of sharp economic hardships will drive people into mass mobilization. First of all, they're out of work or they're worried about it. Second, it's hitting them right where it counts in that physiological or security level of Maslow's hierarchy needs. The other one, I see this all the time when I do insurgency studies, sustained mass violence by the government is a real accelerant on mass mobilizations, but we don't see that here in the U.S. I mean, even with the deaths we're talking about, I'm talking about what you see in Iran or Iraq, where hundreds or even thousands of people are wounded or killed by the government each month. We're nowhere near that level. I mean, it's bad, but we're nowhere near that level. So that was another question on instability. Mike is asking about unionization. Oh, this is a forecast for 2021. Well, Mike, you can submit that as a mega mulleteer through your Patreon account. Yeah, so Mike's curious about unionization of pushing a more organized labor because Biden has several union leaders working with him for the last few months. I mean, ballpark, I think anytime you have a Democratic administration, they might be a little friendlier for union, but if you have a specific forecast, shoot that up to me on Patreon and we'll get it for the New Year's Eve Ask Me Anything for mega mulleteers. So let's see here. Next question we had was somewhat gets to that economic well-being and material, although I want to be careful here. It was a stock market question. Someone was going to ask it. Some investor out there is going to say, hey, where's the stock market going to be at the end of next year relative to where it is now? Now, with the caveat being, it's not the end of the year. I predicted that the New York Stock Exchange would be higher at the end of this year than it was at the start of the year. And as of today, December 2nd, it is 1.8% higher. So I have met the forecast, but all my contingencies, most of my contingencies got activated. I said contingencies that could hurt this would be exogenous. And I didn't predict the pandemic virus as an exogenous, but I did say drastic measures in the Chinese trade war, major stoppage of key oil commodities, the price swing war that occurred between Russia and Saudi Arabia, March, April, I think qualifies for this. It was a commodity shock to the system. It really disrupted the system with commodities, or a sharp recession, which we've had a sharp recession bordering on depression. I also indicated in the forecast that if we have a sharp recession, it will cost Trump the White House. So I feel pretty good about this forecast. I was both right in the overall forecast and also right in all the contingencies of what could go wrong. Now, how is that possible? How can we have all this economic harm and stock exchanges are still doing high? You got to understand the stock exchange is only trading the value of what people perceive as little slips of paper, physical or virtual, which is a share. It has almost no connection to the underlying economy, and people get really wrapped around the axle. And if they're investing, they get in a lot of trouble if they don't remember that all the stock exchange reflects is how people value these little slips of paper that are roughly related to a company. They're not even in control of a company anymore, and how they're going to grow in the future. It's not, I would not use stock exchanges either as a gauge of presidential success or failure or as a gauge of the underlying economy. And this was a trend that started with under President Obama. Everyone would say, the stock market's up, President Obama is doing great. And I'm like, that's not how it works. You cannot attribute a stock market value to a presidential action or a president, because of course Trump went in office and the stock market continued to go up. And Trump's like, yeah, I'm great. The stock, if you look at it, there's a trend going up from the last crash that's been continuous right up until we hit the pandemic crash. So it's one of those things. Stock markets reflect the supply and demand and the pricing of little slips of paper that are virtual or physical, and that's it. Don't overthink the stock market as a good proxy for the overall economy. It's not, and it will not react. It's looking at future expectations. So let me see here if there's any questions. Wanted to thank everyone who's still watching. We've got a couple more. Again, this, just so you know, if you're tuning in late, this is the domestic forecast from the New Year's Eve 2020. Every New Year's Eve, I've done it for 2 years now. I'll go up and I'll go live on New Year's Eve on Facebook and just spitball some answers to some of these questions, our forecast for the coming year. What we're doing is going through the ones I made New Year's Eve 2019 for 2020. There's also links down below. For each one of these has an accompanying article that explains why I made the forecast I did, some of the numbers you can look for, what was my reasoning, and if I'm wrong, how I'm wrong. And the third Wednesday of the month, so the The 16th on that Ask Me Anything, we'll do the foreign and international affair forecast as well as some of the longer term ones. So there's more of this coming up. I just got a couple more of these to do and then we'll be done. In fact, I've got one more forecast to do, which is good because we're at the top of the hour. So the last forecast of domestic short term, this is an interesting one because it again hits in my sweet spot of the study of violence and instability. Will there be movement in firearms regulation to reduce suicide, accidental discharge, domestic abuse, criminal usage, or terrorism? So first of all, if you go to the article, when I described this, I was pretty clear that there's not, like accidental discharge, there's not much more room left to give. There's probably a couple hundred accidental discharge deaths per year in a population of millions of firearm owners and hundreds of millions of firearms. So from a per capita basis, whether you go by people or firearms, accidental discharge is almost a non-issue. I think total, there's under 600 for the country. That's going to change. It goes 500, 600, 700. But it's, when you talk about 15,000 dead from homicide and firearms, another 30,000 dead from suicide, 600 accidental discharges, very little. Firearms are exceptionally safe if handled properly. Almost every accidental discharge is a case of bad handling, and I don't think you're going to see much regulation on this to change. There's just not much room to give. The other ones, suicide, domestic abuse, criminal usage, or terrorism. We'll talk about terrorism first. As I've said for a long time, terrorism is so isolated in its number of incidents that happen, and even with large mass casualty events where you have 25 people killed or 50 people killed, something like that, that seems horrific. It's still a rounding error to these larger buckets, and it's very, very difficult to put in place a regulation to the point where I have said for years, if you're looking at a policy in terrorism, don't adopt that policy because you think it's going to do something to solve that terrorism. Adopt that policy because you think it's going to improve something else and might have a beneficial aspect on terrorism. Don't make terrorism your main reason. The unforeseen consequences on a low frequency event like this will probably, or the unforeseen consequences or negative impacts of a policy will probably overwhelm the benefits on a very rare thing. And that leaves domestic abuse and criminal usage. Those of you who followed me know that most of the homicide deaths, and suicide too. When we talk about homicide, whether it's overall homicide or mass shootings, actually, the majority of these can fall into the two buckets of intimate partner violence, IPV, which includes domestic abuse, and criminal usage. That's the vast majority of, and by criminal, I mean criminal gang usage. That's where the most of these homicide deaths occur. Suicide, as a whole different bucket, is obviously twice as many as homicide. So suicide, if you did an order of magnitude, things that reduce suicide, that's the highest bucket in the firearm deaths, followed by domestic abuse and criminal usage are probably an equal measure, and then everything else is a long tail in terms of number. It goes down from there. So the forecast was, what are we going to see in all these different activities? And I said, there's nothing at the federal level. It's an election year, right? It's 2020. You've got, we just impeached the president. The GOP hates the Democrats. The Democrats hate the GOP. Trump hates everyone. Everyone hates Trump. No, nothing's going to happen at the federal level. That was not a hard forecast. That was a gimme. But I did go deeper into a state by state. And I said, there will be state by state expansions of red flag laws. And each one will be accompanied by its own self-generating weather system of online comments and outrage and things like that. And red flag laws are something I support, which may shock people because I tend to be less in favor of gun control and more in favor of violence reduction, but I do support red flag laws because they are useful in reducing intimate partner violence and suicides. Those are the two big buckets, not terrorism. I don't think red flag laws where they help with mass shootings and terrorism, that's going to be a bonus round that probably comes up once every 100,000 interactions. But far more useful is the red flag, and a red flag laws, for those who don't know, is where it's an adjudicated judicial process where there is some version of hearing, and it varies by state. We can get into this if people want to in another episode because people have opinions, but it's basically an adjudicated process where someone makes a concern raised, a professional or a family member, something like that, then evidence is presented and a judge can order the seizure of weapons in a case of a crisis situation, somewhat similar to someone being involuntarily committed if they are harmed to themselves. Red flag laws can be done in a suicide case. I fear he's going to kill himself. And they have shown, I have the evidence, they do reduce suicide deaths where they are implemented because most suicides are men. Most suicides by men are done with a firearm, and most suicides attempted with a firearm are successful. Take that firearm out of the equation, suicide rates drop, period. It is also showed benefit in IPV, intimate partner violence, because, and it's not on, just because you have you've got a dispute or something. We're talking about situations where you have multiple restraining orders, you have stalking, you have harassment, you have threats. There's a buildup of clear indications. This can help, again, remove that risk and let things cool down. Now, I am a supporter of red flag laws. I know there's disagreement on that, but I'm also a big supporter on something called focused deterrence and pulling levers. This is an overall program I've advocated for a lot, which looks at criminal violence and intimate partner violence, and it's not even trying to get to a judicial proceeding. It's specifically trying to avoid law enforcement. So even though I support red flag laws, which I'm much more in favor of, is focused deterrence and pulling levers, unfortunately, there wasn't much expansion on this. It's very hard for programs like these that are violence reduction programs to get oxygen in a normal year, because half the people are talking about gun control and the other half are talking about not gun control. And I need to do a segment sometime about how all their arguments are wrong, or which arguments they're making are wrong and which ones at least have merit. But they generally spend all the oxygen in the room goes to that, and very little oxygen or funding goes to effective violence reduction programs. Now, these programs in place saw reductions of 17 to 25%, big reductions. Whether that sustains in the pandemic is going to be a question mark. Murder rates are up in most cities. I had made a mid-year forecast that overall crime would be down. I might have to eat my words on that. We'll see where the FBI comes out on the UCR at the when they publish it. But I don't think there was much expansion of this, and the pandemic circumstances definitely threw a monkey wrench in this. So easy answer is no, there's not going to be anything at the federal level. That was an easy answer in a forecast. There may be a more sophisticated version of this next time around. So, okay, so going back to questions, let's see. Okay, Trisha posted a long thing that I think is that's a statement. And so the problem, yep, Hitchhiker's Guide quote, very good. Laura, quick prediction. Will the Democrats or Republicans win the Georgia runoffs for the Senate? I'm telling you, there's a conspiracy against Trump by Republicans in Georgia. And if I was a Republican in Georgia, I'd boycott the election. No, I'm not gonna special Senate runoff races in Georgia, wow, that's a tough one. I'm gonna say the Democrats win the one that wasn't a 30-person runoff. There was one race I'm trying to remember, because I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think Purdue, Ossoff were the ones where they were head-to-head and it was close. That's the one the Democrats will win. The one where Loeffler, the Republican woman who embezzled the stock funds after getting coronavirus briefings, she's going to win that, probably just because the reason she lost is there was like 20 people in the field and the vote got split. I don't see, once you take those split field votes out, and these details could be wrong, I'm doing it off the top of my head, I don't think the Democrats prevail. So Democrats pick up one seat in Georgia. Yeah, and I wouldn't call this as reliable. Ask me again New Year's Eve and I'll give you a much better forecast. Jerry's asking, how do red flag laws interact with domestic abusers who have firearm access at work? Good question. Pretty sure that when an order goes out, remember, there's been a lot of infrastructure for like anti-stalking laws and anti-harassment laws for two people who are in the same workplace. Red flag laws where employees have access to firearms is a bit newer. It hasn't been as well developed, and I haven't heard a lot of cases. So they're not used. These are not laws that are used tens and tens of thousands of times where you get a lot of case study up from it. I'd have to look into that, Jerry. That's a good question. Trisha's asking, has there really been a significant increase in domestic violence due to the pandemic? I don't know. There were indications of risk. So whenever you're talking about suicide or intimate partner violence, there are indicators of risk, which are like calls to hotlines, calls for referrals, support for help. Those are indications of increased risk. The outcome is when you actually have a report of a suicide attempt or completion, or you have an incident of domestic assault. And of course, domestic assault suffers from a reporting bias. Not all that happens gets reported, and especially when you're isolated in the pandemic. My forecast on crime overall in the pandemic was going to be that crime would remain at or no higher than any of the last 5 previous years in the FBI. That's for murder, aggravated assault, rape, and felony robbery. So I may have to eat my words on that. We'll see, Trisha. There was certainly early in the pandemic and throughout, there's been high indications of risk. floods of calls in for support lines, floods of requests for help, people losing contact with their things. So there's a super high risk. We're just going to have to wait to see. That kind of data takes a while to put together. And it may be a while before we really know, because if the reporting was affected, it's already tough to report domestic abuse in situations like that. There's a reporting struggle in there. If that's been infected by the pandemic, it may be a while. Yeah, Farrell, thank you. Warnock is the other one. I'm trying to remember the four candidates. So those are the domestic near-term forecasts. Again, I said we went through about 7 forecasts today. I have about 19 in total to go through. The next segment on Wednesday, December 16th, will be the foreign affairs international ones, as well as ones that are a little bit longer forecast. Again, we'll do an update on current events. If you want to participate in these forecasts, check us out, www.patreon.com/infomullet. Mega Mulleteers, it's the 3rd tier. Send your forecast into me. We'll get it taken care of. If we want to do a little contest with some Mulleteers or senior Mulleteers to get them a chance as well, I just need to have some way of keeping it into 15 or less, because I do put in for each one of these, I've got accompanying article, and so I have to have some way of keeping the number down. I think 19 was a little bit high last year. Kind of took me a while to get them all out, the articles for them, and of course right after I did that, started doing that, Soleimani was killed, which threw all my forecasts up in the air. But if you're interested in this, check us out at Patreon. And as a last last bit is, if you haven't yet, make sure you're staying safe. Be careful about looking at numbers that tell you that COVID's going down. That's probably a testing irregularity during Thanksgiving. It's probably just as high as wave 2. So if you can, stay inside. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, we did a review, a little bit of breaking news or current events, but mainly a review of the forecast. If you haven't yet, like, follow, and share on us. This is where we're at on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, the store, and Patreon. So thanks everyone for their participation today. I really appreciate it. And stay safe. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the Infomullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a Mulleteer and support the Infomullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.